Well, hi, it's Richard Pears from Finextra TV, and a real pleasure today. I'm joined by Dr. Ruth Wandhofer. Hi, Ruth. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you, Richard. Hi.
Lovely to see you again. I've met you a long time ago in Level 39 when you were launching a book, and we had the privilege of sitting and hearing all about that. I've met you on the journey with RTGS, and of course, you're on advisory boards and committees. You're an absolute polymath around the financial services world. So it's a privilege to have you on today. Tell us, as you are sitting there in this kind of nexus of forces in London, in the world of financial services, you've launched this new report, which is with the Ubiquitech Group. Easy to say for me. Tell us a bit more about why you've done this, what it's about, and how you've actually got to this point in your career that you feel this is what's needed.
Yes, great question. So, I mean, my career is quite varied. I spent several years in investment banking. I spent years as a lobbyist in Brussels negotiating legislation, particularly on the payment space that opened up the floodgates for fintech innovation, interestingly, and designing payment schemes. And then I spent many years in Citigroup in a global transaction business, both on regulation, on strategy, on product development and innovation. But I also spent a lot of time with fintechs, mentoring them, learning about them, and also researching topics such as central bank digital currencies in a PhD already 4, 5, 6 years ago. So lots of different interests that all connect, I guess, the mix of policy, innovation, technology, finance. And inevitably, this continues to spread out to add topics like identity, network, etc. So I was coming from this space where several years ago, I was still very, very embedded in the payments world. And I felt the world is more and more becoming digital. We have cryptocurrencies, we have new technologies on the horizon, but we're still in a bit of an old world. We use cash, we use cards, but it doesn't necessarily get much more exciting than that. We had then the arrival of open banking, which is also still slowly picking up and moving forward. And I thought we need to do something on digital payments, I felt, and I know that people do reviews. The governments ask them to do a review on, the fintech space or innovation space. And nobody asked me for a review, which is fine. But several years ago, it really started with payments. And then the years passed by, and I spent 3 years as a chair of the Payment Systems Regulator Statutory Panel. And there I got the opportunity to actually work on digital payments. And I did a digital payment review and initiative, which has at least led to some innovation and acceleration in the open banking space with certain developments like variable recurring payment. But by that time, I felt this is not enough. I mean, we live in a country where we still have large chunks of areas without network or with very slow network. So how can we think about elusive topics like central bank digital currencies and putting everything online and creating a smart data economy built on open banking if we don't even have the network? And so I really felt it's time to get our heads together. So I picked a few experts with me in this group. And we basically said, look, nobody's asking us, but we have something to say.
Yeah.
And we held a number of workshops last year and basically came up with this report.
Fantastic. So the report is from the Ubiquitech Group, which you chair. Tell us really, you've set I think the sense of it there, but give us the sort of the vision, the purpose, what you're hoping to achieve here.
Yeah. So talking a little bit about the content of the report, the report has 5 pillars in terms of the key recommendations, and it really looks at the pillar of cybersecurity. It looks at the pillar of network, availability, innovation, sustainability. It looks at digital identity and verification and authentication, which is really important if you want to unlock the digital economy. It looks at trade. We've just adopted a fabulous electronic trade documentation bill. UK is a leader in terms of law and disputes around global trade. And it also looks at digital skills, which we, of course, need to unlock all of this. And these 5 pillars are actually linked back to what is happening at the moment. We had the adoption of some really important acts in the UK. We had the adoption of the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, which is all about cleaning up Companies House and making the UK a more attractive market. We have the Online Safety Act that was adopted. We had the Electronic Trade Documentation Act. And also we will now have soon the Data Protection and Digital Information Act, which is currently still a bill. And this is really the one that ties all the others together in terms of making sure that the protection of the data and the individual and the way you identify goes across both trade, anything you do online, but also, of course, in terms of the business context, how you identify businesses and assets. And so there is this regulatory backdrop to these 5 pillars. And then, of course, there is a section around how the UK, including the City of London as a financial center, but the UK more globally, really plays a leading role in this space, or could play a leading role if it would really lift up on these 5 pillars. Because at the moment, even though we would love to be a digital economy and we talk about open banking, building smart economies and smart data out, we are quite far away from this. And so the purpose of the report is to bring very practical recommendations around these 5 areas and to start, of course, implementing via sandboxes, pilots, identifying the right groups of stakeholders to work together. There are elements that we'll probably have to carry into standards going forward, as much as certain policies that we will maybe need to review or create out of this, even though we are quite well set up now on the regulatory front. And so it's really the beginning. It's a sort of launch pad for many, many different things to develop out of.
Fantastic. So let's kind of make this real for some. If we're talking about the sustainable finance channel, just as an illustration, of course, what you're talking about is much wider. But take this as an illustration. We often talk about the traceability of data as a way of understanding whether a product or service is indeed itself sustainable. And let's talk about something. So Indonesia, we have a soft commodity. It purports to be green and organic or whatever it may be. It comes through the supply chain. It goes through many handlers, many companies are involved. It ends up as a company, which ends up in a portfolio, which ends up in the pension of you and I. And we might say, well, I want to make the world a better place. I'll put my money in that pension. But the confidence that all of that chain of action has actually been done correctly, it all very much dependent on the sort of thing you're talking about, isn't it?
Yes, so clearly in that context, you also need to make sure that the source is a reliable source. So you need to have the right control mechanisms and standards and processes in terms of the origin of a product or raw material, which has also been a bit of a challenge in the past when we thought about fabulous blockchain implementations, but nobody actually checked how something went onto the blockchain in the first place. So it is about having the right clean data and origin confirmations that requires global standards. It is also then about that network that carries the data. So for that, you need network and data standards. Having legitimized the digital nature of trade documentation itself should now lead to all of these pieces in the documentary chain to digitize. And because the UK is basically the leader of global law in terms of common law for 80% of all trade contracts, this should immediately, by virtue of having this law, carry into the actual physical data supply chain to start digitizing pieces. And that is exactly where in the trade chapter in this report, we're talking about leading the creation of a reliable system, including the standards and the provenance and the identification and verification and authentication of both organizations and assets. So we often talk about digital identity from a human individual perspective, but here we're actually saying not only the organization, which we know the legal entity identifier, for example, which is of course already a global standard that requires adoption more, but we also talk about identifying the actual asset. And so this comes together in a very logical supply chain context where the UK could play a key role in creating this reliable system and driving those standards forward.
And that's beautifully put. And I think people often think, well, that's all well and good, but how do you actually prosecute? When you've got all of this, how do you actually enforce it? And I think I was talking to a couple of King's councils recently, and they were saying, global fraud is something that is really important to obviously, you know, all nations, and the law and regulation that is in place would allow one to actually be able to come back to the UK and prosecute a case, even though it may be happening, you know, on a far distant shore. So, you know, rest assured, they said to me, this is serious, we would prosecute. But what's your, you know, your view on how fraud and prosecution of fraud fits into what you're doing as well?
Yeah, so disputes and prosecution, if it's under English common law, would happen in the UK. They would happen in the City of London courts. And that is exactly where tying in this modernization of the law with the actual supply chain that by virtue of using the law will have to modernize is exactly the opportunity. I think it's also then interesting to think about further technology advances. When we look to the crypto world, for example, we've actually seen that law enforcement has been able to deliver a court order as an NFT wrapper around a digital asset. And they were able to basically deliver an injunction around the asset.
Mm.
So nobody, not the legitimate and not the fraudulent owners of the asset, because they stole those Bitcoins, is able to actually get hold of it. And that was because, in this instance, Singapore, which has the only blockchain court in the world, has actually enforced this law, and they had a technical means to deliver it. So this is, in my view, probably the next stage of technology innovation, where, again, the UK, as a global leader in trade in terms of law, has to look at how they embed that into their courts as well.
Oh, fascinating. Okay, so we've got the vision, we've got the building blocks. I think we've talked about maybe a kind of an example, one of many, which can help us understand where all these ingredients are being sort of put into practice. And then we've spoken about maybe some of the ways that you can enforce the law. What are the things that you're trying to achieve, and what's the sort of time scale? Are you lobbying? Are you pulling together working groups? You know, what are you going to do with this paper? How can people join in? What do you see over the next sort of 12 months, 18 months or so?
Yeah, so the most imminent piece is the last stage of negotiation of the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill, which is still a bill, which is actually happening after the Easter holidays until the 24th of this month. So this is now at committee stage in the House of Lords. And this bill is so critical because it can wire back to all these other bills I mentioned earlier. So it is about making sure that it's the right wording inside so that this bill becomes basically the bill to rule them all, because it's all about data privacy, protection, identification, linking back to the other ones. So that is a very imminent step. The second step is, of course, in the context of the City of London and the Smart Data Economy Initiative of the current Lord Mayor, Michael Manelli. We are also helping another working group that is looking at specific use cases around digital identity and trade to actually use our report as the baseline and to then start developing working groups and start piloting. So we are looking for more stakeholders to join. Particularly on digital identity, it's a very interesting thing because we have existing businesses in this country that offer various ways of identifying an individual. It can be via your bank data, it can be via self-sovereign data, it can be via universities. So there are different technological and identity type solutions out there already. And I want to encourage more to be out there and more to be used, because the identity in a digital context is your access into the digital economy. But as I said, on the trade side, of course, it's also important to build it out further beyond the legal entity into the asset. So that is another piece of piloting this, for example. So what I'm trying to do now is to make sure that more and more people are aware of the report, because each section, each pillar has so many different elements where many businesses and ideas can flourish, and they should feel encouraged to do so because they all come together in order to build that digital fabric which we need in the UK. And before we have this fabric, we also cannot think about a digital sterling, for example, if we think about the central bank digital currencies, because we have places where people have no network, or they might not have digital skills which are required to engage with those solutions, or they might not feel secure enough. We need to build trust with better security online, better authentication, multimodal biometrics, for example, in order to enable people to use those solutions in the future.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people will be thinking of people who are unable to change or resistant to change, and will be listening to this conversation thinking, "Oh my goodness, this sounds like a world of complexity I don't want to engage with." But I mean, the outcome of this would be that people would have a much more seamless way of interacting with, whether it's, I suppose, accessing benefits all the way through to actually, high-end traders. I mean, it's fundamentally it speeds up and reduces friction. Is that your vision of the intention?
And it's beyond financial services. I think that is the critical component here, because we talk even in the DPDI bill that I just mentioned about from open banking, and the smart data economy is built on open banking. Open banking started with payments, is going into open finance. We had great outcomes of the CFIT trials earlier last month that already demonstrated the potential value that can be generated by opening this up. But my vision is to say, we can use those secure data highways that are still in the build process and have to be made more secure across every part of the economy. I should be able to be sharing some NHS data with a particular university for particular research purposes. I should not be forced to divulge all my data, maybe to the insurance company in this instance, but I, as an individual user, use my identity and my secure data highway to pick a specific asset to share for a specific purpose. So the whole idea of consent-based data sharing from open banking should come into every part of the economy, and that will also benefit businesses.
Yeah.
It's cross-sectoral sharing, it's within sector sharing, it's businesses and individuals, and of course also government. And the key recommendation here, which is also linking to sustainability, is do not duplicate data all the time. We keep on creating the same data again and again instead of finding secure ways to allow access to view or share, as opposed to copy again and again. So we want to make sure we can cut the data mountain, which is a storage problem, which is sustainability problematic, and also make it more secure in the context of data minimization with the general data privacy and protection rules.
Yeah. I would actually say, having that's where we met really with the whole open API economy, fintech, open banking world. When I'm in my sustainability world, it just feels like we're sort of reinventing wheels that have already been put in motion quite a lot of the time when you talk about this, secure pathways. Where can people find out more? How can they get involved, Ruth?
Yeah, so the first step one is to read the report. It's not very long. It's got the recommendation at the front, sharp and short, and it has a longer annex where you get more context on the different areas with more data. So that can be helpful for those that want to read more. They can contact me. I'm building out networks at the moment. We already, as I said, have some working groups in this other initiative that we're starting to build. My first point would be, apart from making sure the bill goes through into the right act, to start some pilots in that space. So we want to join forces both with people on the global trade supply chain in terms of the data highway and the reliable system, as much as the identification and digital identity solutions. So connect with me and we will build groups as we go along. Until now, all of this was privately funded. It was just brains put together. But because the substance is so important and it's time critical to execute, of course, I invite also government to look at it and other interested parties, because this can only be done by private sector initiatives as much as governments supporting this, for example, in the context of net zero. And we do see a need for more funding in some areas, which will often be private, and also for the sectors that really use those new networks. There should be an element of sponsorship coming out of creating better networks and better technology that connects everybody.
Amazing. All right. Well, fantastic stuff. All power to you. We'll obviously have an update, I'm sure, sometime in the near future. But for now, Ruth, thanks very much indeed.
Great. Thank you.